Okay, I am recording now. And again, the purpose of this session is to go over the answers of the midterm number 1 so that you can use this material for studying in preparation for the final exam, well, at the end of the semester. Right now, it seems like a useless exercise, but believe me, once you are ready for the final and you see the amount of material, this session, I hope, is going to be useful for you and also for those that are not here today. Anyway, before I start, any questions, any comments, anybody right now that has not seen the grade in your exam? Great. I was very careful with trying to avoid missing anybody, and I was customizing the answers and all that. So it took me a while, but it's finally done. It's finally done. I don't know what other professors say or think, but grading is not my favorite part of teaching. Although I should say that the scores were relatively good. Actually, before I go over the exam, I meant to do this and I forgot. But I believe, well, I don't want to give you the wrong number. So let me actually go to my roster with your grades. I am not going to share those. I just want to see the average. So the average score was 80.5. 80.5. 2 people failed the exam. There were a few D's. A few C's. But most of you are in the AB range, which is very encouraging. I also should mention that I was very flexible when grading, as you probably saw, because this is an upper division GE. So although most of you have a strong economics background, around half of you don't. So I don't want to throw terms like elasticities, slopes, and things like that. Although in some of the suggested answers, I do that. But again, for those of you that don't have the econ background, you don't have to worry about that. There is no charts, no graphs, no equations. But those of you in econ, feel free to use them if they help your argument. Okay. Anyway, so let me then quickly go over this exam, and then well, I'll tell you what we're going to do next. I think we're going to spend the whole time doing this, but we'll see. Okay, so are you looking at the exam right now, the midterm number 1? Give me a thumbs up, please, just to make sure. I don't see any thumbs up. Okay, thank you, David. All right, so I realized that, Justin, just enter here. I realized that these definitions are probably a bit long, not what you had in mind, but again, I was very flexible. So I didn't penalize you because they were too short. But anyway, you probably saw that in the first part 1, there is a section in yellow that basically subtracting the number of points from that particular part. And the same on part 2. There is a number with a negative sign highlighted in yellow that is subtracting the number of points for part 2. So if you adopt these 2 negative numbers, well, plus your score should add up to 100. So anyway, that's the point I'm trying to make, and that's how the exam was graded. Anyway, encomienda. First of all, this is or was a land tenure system. Most of you got this question right, but some of you, didn't mention that this happened during the colonization in Latin America, that, in return for the land, these people were supposed to provide protection and also teachings in the Catholic faith and other things that are part of this concept of encomienda. So, since each question is worth 5 points, for those of you missing 1 or 2 elements, I took 1 or 2 points, but most of you got it right. I am going to go relatively fast, but if at some point you guys want to stop and ask a particular question, clarification, or comment in general about any of these answers, please let me know, okay? So right now we just cover encomienda. I know This is a Spanish word. There is no translation to English. So this is the way you need to say it, encomienda. Anyway, number 2, primary exports. This is primarily raw materials. I'm talking about agriculture, mining, forestry, fisheries. And those are these natural resources that are going to be sold or have been sold to other countries from Latin America. And they have very low value added, or in some cases, zero value added. Now, I don't know if you are familiar with this concept, just because, you know, business in general, but it is well known that in general, the profit margin that provides, you know, the largest majority of the profits for a company, for a business, comes from value added. So think about this, and we are going to explore this later, but so this is a real life example. Mexico is the largest producer of tomato, probably in the world. I may need to check on that one. Don't quote me on this, but it's probably one of the largest producers of tomato, raw tomatoes. So guess what? So we export in Mexico, they export tomatoes to the US, and that's where they smash the tomatoes, produce salsas, ketchup, and then they sell it back to Mexico. This is true. And the reason this is happening is because, again, you know, over time, the system has been designed for developing countries, Latin America, to sell these raw materials, primary exports, so that rich countries can add value and then sell it back. Another example is oil. I think I mentioned this before, again with Mexico. So Mexico produces a lot of oil, a primary good from mining, I guess. But Mexico doesn't have enough, doesn't have the refinery capacity to produce gasoline. So Mexicans sell the oil to the US, they go to Houston in Texas, they process the oil there, they produce the gasoline, and then Mexicans have to buy the gasoline back. And I can give you countless examples of this, right? Wow, with trees for paper, for example. Anyway, number 3, and again, remember, stop me. You can feel free to unmute yourself because I only have a bar and I see 4 or 5 of you. I don't see all of you. So if you have a comment or something, please feel free to unmute yourself so that you can add or comment or ask. All right, debt trap. So the basic idea is this. The state made investments, borrowing money, in projects that were going to supposed to provide a return to the investment in a time horizon that didn't match the terms of the loan. You know, that's basically the idea. So I think I used the example of a highway that, you know, they borrow, you know, let's say $100 million, and they are supposed to pay back in 10 years, but the road is going to be completed probably in 10 years, but it's not going to have the capacity to generate enough money to pay it back until perhaps year 15 or 16 or even longer than that. And of course, that produces a debt trap because, well, you're supposed to be paying the debt, but you don't have the means to do so, right? And this happened all over, you know, all over Latin America in different projects, not just highways. I'm talking about seaports, hospitals, dams, hydroelectrics, especially large projects that require a massive injection of capital. And again, in principle, this does, I mean, there is nothing wrong with, you know, borrowing money. The problem is that you have to generate the capacity to pay it back. And they did that, but, you know, the timing was totally off. And again, in hindsight, this seems like a no-brainer. Like, how is that they didn't see that? Well, again, remember, we're talking about people with limited business acumen, some corruption elements, and other things. Yeah, it sounds pretty ridiculous now, right? Anyway, let me move on to petrodollars. So this was a popular question for you to pick, but also was one of the questions that most of you got wrong. Because basically you said, oh, this is the dollars that come from the sale of oil, or that was one, or another typical response that, oh, that's the American dollars that the US pays for oil. Well, that's not the right answer. So the idea of petrodollars, like I explained before, is that in the 1970s, OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, decided to punish oil consuming countries like the US and others because of politics. This has to do with the Kuala Lumpur War and other problems in the Middle East. But anyway, Saudi Arabia and other countries said, we are going to reduce production. That's the quota. And then the price of oil went up. And this was unexpected. The price of the oil quadrupled very quickly. And suddenly these oil-rich countries had all this money that was deposited in international banks. Now, the bank doesn't want to keep the money in the vault because they lose money. The opportunity cost is what they are losing if they don't make loans. And this is when they discover Latin America, in the words of Arnold Harberger, the Chicago economist. So this was a problem, guys, eventually, because the banks were not very responsible in the way they were offering the loans. The idea was to give the money away, even if the business plan was not very good. And of course, later they have to, they pay for that when the debt crisis came. But anyway, that's the idea of the petrodollars. Okay, let me go one more. Dutch disease. The central idea of the Dutch disease is that when a country devotes resources exclusively to a particular sector, this hot sector, they neglect other sectors. And that produces this deindustrialization process that is equivalent to the opposite of diversifying your portfolio. Like in finance, to minimize risk, you invest in different assets, some of higher risk, medium risk, no risk. The idea is that you have a more or less balanced portfolio. In case something goes wrong in one area, you can recover on the other. But if you put all your resources into one sector and something goes wrong in that particular sector, you are in big trouble. You catch the Dutch disease. The most recent example of this is obviously the case of Venezuela, because for decades, they invested most of the resources, I'm talking about the state resources, and by state I mean the government, in the oil industry. And I don't know if you are aware of this, but for many years, when the price of oil was high enough, Venezuela made a lot of money, and they forgot about investing in the pharmaceutical industry for medicine, in the ag sector for food, in the textile sector for clothes, and they were importing all of this. So remember, you generate a lot of money by selling in the international markets. You get dollars, euros, any foreign exchange, and then you use these in your bucket of the balance of payments to buy what you don't produce. The problem is that when you go overboard, when you do this in excess, and then the price of, in the case of Venezuela, the price of the oil goes down, your bucket starts drying up. And then you discover that, wait a second, we don't have a textile industry. We don't have a pharmaceutical industry. We don't have a food sector. How are we going to feed the population? How are we going to keep the population healthy? And you get the idea, right? You get the idea. Again, in hindsight, seems like a very not a very smart thing to do, but it's still happening. I mean, in the 21st century, Venezuela is the most dramatic and the most recent example of the Dutch disease, guys. Okay, let me make a pause here. Any comments, any questions right now? I've covered 5 out of the 7 so far. All right. So let me keep going then. Number 6, the Washington Consensus. This, I realize, this is a difficult, a tough term to define. But, you know, you could have said it's a term coined by Mr. Williamson in 1989. You know, some of you actually wrote, oh, Washington means all these institutions in Washington, D.C., and consensus means, you know, how they agree that these policies were sufficient so that these institutions were going to support Latin America because finally they came to their senses. So instead of utilizing these dependency theory structuralist arguments, finally they were understanding that the neoliberal recipe was the way to go. And again, by that we mean deregulation, liberalization, privatization, and so forth. So unless you had no clue, I took all the points off, but most of you got all the points on these questions if you pick it, because I realize it's a tough term to define. Number 7, this is not very difficult, and some of you didn't get it right. You know, some of you said, oh, race to the bottom is the competition for market share. No, not quite. Race to the bottom is the competition through prices. No, it has nothing to do with that. So the competition is among poor countries to attract investment, FDI, foreign direct investment, that comes in the form of multinational or transnational corporations. But in order to become attractive, these poor countries have to lower standards or reduce taxation. So they say, you know, if you need to you need to, you know, pollute the air. Of course, they don't say it that way, but you know, it is well known that if a particular multinational corporation, say, producing clothes, is going to come to your country, you know that there is some ink and there is some materials that are going to be, that have to be disposed somehow, or they're going to throw smoke. Well, all of these regulations are going to be relaxed, but just come to our countries. Now, when you think about this is attractive for multinational corporations because more regulation increases the cost of production. You know, if they need to install a filter, or they need to treat a particular chemical before it's released into the water or into the air or whatever, that just increases the production cost, making the profit margin smaller and less competitive in world markets. So all this reduction, this lowering of the standards allows these multinational corporations to produce at a cheaper cost, and therefore producing at a much bigger profit margin. Now, the problem is that when one country lowers one standard, the other country competing against this one is going to lower that standard plus another one and another one. And this produces this race to the bottom, And that is not good for the developing world, guys, because, you know, we have seen situations where, well, you wonder, how is it possible that they have children, you know, 14 years old, 16 years old girls working 10, 12 hours in this factory? How is it possible that this river that used to be blue, you know, full with life, now it's red and no wildlife whatsoever, no plants, no fish, nothing. It's just chemicals. How is that possible? Well, this race to the bottom is part of the explanation. You know, unfortunately, many multinational corporations use and abuse this structure to make more money. And I was talking to one of you last week about this, that I really want you to emphasize, guys, because, you know, people in rich countries like the US, our country, they sometimes even brag about, you know, acquiring stock, shares in the stock market, you know, and, you know, all they care, you know, investors in the stock market, is a higher rate of return. And they demand, as stockholders, from the CEO and the board of directors of these multinational corporations, that they basically provide what they need, which is a higher rate of return, dividends. They want to make money. We want to make money, right? On our pension system, on our portfolio. And, the problem is that all of these people that live 3,000-4,000 miles away from Brazil, from Costa Rica, or even Mexico, they don't see what's happening, what all these multinational corporations need to do in these countries in order to increase the profit margin so that they can give the investors the higher rate of return that they demand. So this is an interesting situation, guys, because once again, the system that we have created is not that the US is the bad guy, or the Canadians or the Europeans. No. It's the same thing. I am not trying to demonize American corporations. No, in fact, let me give you a story. Some of you that live in Fresno probably have seen these trucks of the second largest construction company in the world. And this is called CEMEX, C-E-M-E-X. That's in Spanish for Mexican cement, or Cementos Mexicanos, right? So they have a mine right there by Woodward Park. That's that close, guys. And a few years ago, they engaged into this litigation with Fresno County, because they were trying to blow up a mountain that was sacred for Indian Americans. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that it's not the Americans, it's not the Canadians, it's not the Europeans. No, you have multinational corporations from developing countries like Mexico and Brazil or Argentina doing exactly the same thing in other countries. Sometimes within Latin America, and sometimes, guess what? In the US itself, close to home, here in Fresno, in Woodward Park. I don't know if it bothers you, but if you run, you bike like I do in Woodward Park, well, guess what? You have all these trucks. And there is sections of the park where you cannot go in because there is mining activity going on, blowing up stuff with dynamite, and it's dusty. And of course, it's close to the river, the San Joaquin River, which bothers so many people as well. Anyway, so this race to the bottom is more important in developing countries, because those are the ones that have to compete for this investment. In the US, we don't have to do that. But the point I'm trying to make is that this behavior by multinational corporations is the same, or quasi the same, regardless of the home country that hosts this corporation. Could be a rich nation, could be a poor country, or a developing country like Mexico. Anyway, so I have my own issues with the stock market, but we can talk about that later. Anyway, questions, comments. I already covered the 7 definitions of part 1. For those of you that just joined the session, I decided to go over the answers in the exam so that you can use this session as study material for the final exam that is going to be comprehensive. So you can always go back to this recording and go over this document. Anyway, since now there are no questions or comments, let me go over the short answer ones. Question number 1, list at least 2 institutional constraints during the colonial period that were considered retardants. Most of you that picked this question got it right. So I think you identified what I was talking about very quickly. So in the lecture notes, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Most of you pick scholasticism and mercantilism. Some of you also pick Spanish law. And it was between these 3. So I don't have much to say about these other than like 95% of you that picked this question got it right. All right. Number 2, according to dependency theory, how is that developed nations exploit the underdeveloped periphery? For some reason, like half of you that picked this question went, in an essay talking about many things, which are not necessarily wrong, but they, for example, some of you talk about taking advantage of a cheap labor, which in a way is true. They also, or a few other things. But I was really more interested in, things like profit repatriation. The idea that multinational corporations typically do not reinvest the profits they make in the host country. Instead, they ship all these profits back to the mother country. So Volkswagen in Mexico is not reinvesting a lot of money of the profit they make in Mexico. Most of the monies, they go back to Germany, or they are used to pay the dividends of the stockholders of VW, the Volkswagen. Let me see. Anyway, another one is this, the decline in terms of trade. This is huge, guys. This is very important. And again, to refresh your mind, this refers to the idea that as the, this is the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis that I am going to explain later. But the idea is that over time, the relative price of primary goods, again, agriculture, fisheries, mining, tends to go down, again, relative to manufacture high technology goods. So over time, this is what happened. In a given year, say Honduras has to produce 1 metric ton of pineapples in exchange for 1 computer produced in the US. But because the relative demand favors computers over pineapples, in 2 or 3 years, Honduras has to produce not 1 metric ton, but 2 metric tons of pineapples in order to buy the same computer. And here is the problem, guys. You may have computers in your house, one in this room, or TV sets, or cars, or phones, or whatever. You can have 2, 3, 4 of them. But how many pineapples can you eat? Or how many pineapples can you accumulate in your refrigerator? And for what purpose, right? We don't do that. So that's the other problem, that you have a limit. It's capped. Consumption is typically capped because we're talking about food in this case of pineapples. And on the other hand, manufactured goods, they don't have a cap. How many pairs of shoes you have in your closet that you don't use? And you don't have 10 pineapples in your refrigerator. You get the idea? Anyway, that's another one. Obviously, the race to the bottom, the effect that we already explained, and a few others. We also talk about changing the taste, the consumer behavior of Latin American countries. Anyway. All right, let me move on to Anton. You have a comment or question? Please go ahead.
So on questions like this, a list version, or even the first one where you just give the kind of the simple point and go through it.
Yes, that could work. Yes. Yeah, I don't remember your exam in particular, Anton, but yeah, I mean, discuss the main arguments. You can do a list like I did here, or you can do, like discussing 2 or 3 points in the form of a paragraph. That works too. Again, I just did a list here and in other questions after, because it's easier for me to explain this rather than, and it's easy to summarize in one section, easy to locate rather than, I could show you the lecture notes, and that's not the point. Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right. Number 3. This is the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis that basically explains, this is the theory behind of this empirical observation that I explained before with the pineapples. The argument that as the global economy grows, and of course this is happening all the time, global income increases. And if you remember from your basic economics classes, normal goods behave the following way. When your income goes up, you buy more of them. The problem is that when that happens, we typically tend to buy more manufactured goods than more primary goods. And that's the source that's the source of the problem, what I'm trying to explain here. And again, this is mostly geared to all of you with more econ background. This is due to the relatively low income elasticity for agricultural goods. Yes, we buy more bananas. Yes, we buy more pineapples. Yes, we buy more primary goods. But relatively speaking, we buy a lot more manufactured goods. And when that happens, once again, from the point of view of Latin American countries, this produced this decline in the terms of trade, because Latin American countries have to buy an increasingly higher amount of primary goods in exchange for the same amount, or sometimes even a smaller amount of manufactured goods. And in the eyes of Latin American people, this is a very raw deal. It's, they don't like it, because obviously, like I said, there is a limit to this. When you pair this situation with the value added argument that I discussed like 20 minutes ago. So I am selling you my oil, you process the oil, produce the gasoline, and then you sell it back to me. Even worse, right? Because you're getting when I was talking to some of you last week, I explained this as, different ways to skin the cat. You have this profit repatriation. That's one way that you're draining resources rather than investing in the home country, in the host country. Another way is this, that you are practicing this unequal exchange because of the decline in terms of trade. Over time, for one computer, you get first 1 metric ton of pineapples, but in 2 or 3 years, you can get 2 metric tons of pineapples. That's awesome for us in the US, or tomatoes, or gasoline, or logs for paper. I'm talking about trees, or for furniture. It's all over the place. We get the raw materials, we process this raw material, add this value added, and then sell it back. Not just to Latin America, all over the world, but that's where the profit margin is. Anyway, let's see, number 4. What were some of the problems? Most of you got this right, but I really wanted you to understand that this question is very important because of what's happening in the second half of the class. So we are going to be talking about increases in income inequality and poverty. We also are going to talk about this neglect of the agricultural sector, which is tied to the massive migration of farmers from Mexico, especially to the US. That land, guess where? Here in the valley. So we're going to be tying all these things that, perhaps in the mind of you happened in the 80s, in the 70s. Well, they did, but they have a direct implication to what's happening now in 2021, not just in the US, I'm talking about here in Fresno, in the Valley, right? I also want you to realize that when you abandon in Latin America, you abandon the countryside, because the idea is to industrialize, to become part of the modern world. We don't want to miss the train of globalization and all these ideas. Well, guess what? You see a massive migration from the countryside to the cities. And of course, the cities, when they fail to absorb this incoming workforce, that produce what we now know in Latin America and many developing countries in the world as the underground informal economy. Street vendors, street performers, but not only that, in a way, partially, this also gave origin to illegal industries like, kidnapping, organ trafficking, human trafficking, all sorts of things that, are really bad for humans. but they are taking place because, well, again, partially we have abandoned certain sectors of the economy that otherwise could be absorbing all these people rather than going out and behaving in an illicit way. And also this part, one consequence of the long application of the ISI was that under this protected bubble, Latin America didn't have the opportunity to develop this entrepreneurial class. These infant industries, they never grew. They never were able to achieve economies of scale. The cost structure remained high. And when the IMF and the World Bank came and opened up the economy, trade liberalization, all of these things, they were decimated. They were destroyed by competition, in a matter of months. And of course, that opened up the opportunity for multinational corporations to, go and take advantage of the weak business acumen and the high cost structure of the domestic industries. Yeah. Anyway, so this question number 4 is very important for what is going to happen in the second half. Number 5, list and briefly explain at least 2 major causes that originated the debt crisis. I think most of you got this right. I think it was pretty clear. So in your lecture notes, you might find 4. The debt trap is one of them. Unsustainable economic policies, where we talk about Keynesian, populist government expenses to stimulate the economy. We also talk about number 3, external shocks. This is an interesting one because we made the comparison between what happened internationally in Latin America with what happened in the US in 2007 with the housing crisis. So many of these loans were made in flexible interest rates. So when Paul Volcker, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, trying to fight inflation in the US, increase the interest rates, which is the opposite of what we are doing now. We are dropping interest rates. Back then it was the opposite. Suddenly making your monthly payment became impossible because you were engaged in a loan with a flexible interest rate. So that originated that eventually in 1982, Mexico said, I'm sorry, guys, this is impossible for me. I cannot pay you back. Domino effect and spreads out throughout Latin America. So most of you got this question right. All right. Number 6, what are the main components of the IMF adjustment program and why people in Latin America oppose? Well, I gave you a list of 10 things. So, some of you mentioned 2 or 3. Some of you actually put a lot of pretty good stuff. Some of you didn't get it. Some of you, I don't know, wrote something else. But I guess like 70% of you got this question right. Why people in Latin America oppose? Well, again, we are going to continue this conversation in the second half, but mainly opposition comes from the social and economic cost that these policies have produced. And this is precisely the point of departure to what we are going to be discussing on Wednesday, which is the origin of the new left. Where are these guys coming from and why? What was the political platform that launched them to become presidents of Bolivia, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Peru, Ecuador, all of these huge countries, very important countries, right after all of this happened, became presidents of their countries running on leftist platforms, populist, and this is why we call them the new left. But I am going to save this conversation for Wednesday. All right, and finally, number 7, why the so-called Washington consensus has been under attack. Questions 6 and 7 are similar in a way because Washington consensus contains the IMF adjustment program. But basically the idea is that the attack is coming from the fact that many very astute, very smart politicians in Latin America use this Washington consensus concept as a target. Trying to change the original meaning that Mr. Williamson tried to give during this presentation in 1989, and Latin American politicians, they start calling, oh, well, this is, again, a new type of imperialism. The US is orchestrating this anti-Yankee mentality, right? This laissez-faire global economy where GDP is the only thing that matters and blah, blah, blah. Market fundamentalism, essentially, right? So they start using this as the scapegoat, somebody to blame for the misfortune of Latin America. And of course, many people believe them. Many people believe them. You know, they start talking about, well, the loans are going to be rescheduled. You know, they are going to be the negotiations produce that now we are going to pay not in 20 years, but 50 years, which obviously reduces the monthly payment, but that's a very good business for any bank to keep the customers hooked to the debt. And of course, this only saved the banks from going bankrupt because Latin America was not going to pay them. So all of these politicians start using these arguments to say, you know what, this has to be ended. We need to figure out to cut the ties with the IMF, to cut the ties with the World Bank, to repudiate the Washington Consensus. And the only way to do that is, guess what? And again, this is what I am going to discuss on Wednesday. The only way to do that is by going back to the original policies of the 60s. No way, yes. You know, they start going back to dependency theory arguments, structuralist arguments, you know, the idea that organizing themselves in the South rather than trying to negotiate with the rich countries, it was going to be better because clearly they were taking advantage of Latin America. So think about this as a political discourse in Latin America in, you know, the late 1990s, where many people were, well, didn't have jobs, income inequality was on the rise, poverty was on the rise, prices were again going up, and worse, you saw that many domestic Latin American families were getting pretty rich. Because remember, after privatization, many families acquired the pharmaceutical industries, telecommunications, many industries that used to be in the hands of the government now are in the hands of families in Latin America that are doing really, really well. While people in the countryside totally abandoned. You know, there are no schools, there are no hospitals, there are no roads. Later, I want to show you some, I want to tell you some stories of some places where, you know, you probably are thinking, how is that, for example? Let me close, stop sharing this. Let me close with this idea. Some of you are probably thinking, how is that these people in narco traffic are able to, you know, plant all these things in these towns, and there is an, you know, an airplane and a tarmac, and well, guess what? I mean, this is probably going to sound like, no way, professor, but it's true. I mean, I've seen it. I can take you to these places. So in many of these, in some of these towns, they have been so abandoned by the government, federal, state, and even the local government, where, I mean, I'm talking about they have no electricity, no sewage, no schools, no hospitals, and all they know what to do is farming. Well, this group of narco traffic people comes to this town and they say, well, who is in charge here? I am in charge. Well, I have a proposition for you. What are you growing right now? I don't know, beans, corn. Well, guess what? We're going to give you new seeds. You're going to change your crop. And in return, we are going to, guess what? We are going to build a road for you so you can take your, you know, your family to the city or whatever. We can build a school. And in some cases, they actually built a church for the town. Things that in theory are supposed to be responsibility of the state, right? Public goods and public services. Well, now these responsibilities being taken over by, you know, people in narco traffic. And guess what? The township people in this town, they love it. They love it because now they have a school, they have a basketball court, they have electricity, they have a road. and you know, they have protection by these guys. It's crazy, right? So we are going to be discussing all these things so that you understand why things that seem impossible to happen have a relatively reasonable explanation behind. Yeah. Anyway, let me stop here. Questions, comments?
Professor,
Yes.
do you think that many Latin Americans at the end of like the 1980s just like wanted to conform to their position as like the periphery and their export focused economies, or were they still trying to establish their own like name and become like the center countries?
Well, that's a good question, Diego. If you think about who was in charge in the late 1980s, I think they had a genuine belief that they could become part of the leaders of the global economy. I mean, I think they truly believed that there was a possibility that they could, you know, advance Latin America to the next stage and all that. But again, in hindsight, once you start thinking about the race to the bottom effect, terms of trade declining, profit repatriation, and all of these things together, then you realize that's probably not going to happen. If they, you know, like they did, they kept the structure, it was not going to happen. And this is how this populist leadership in Latin America, in a very skillful rhetoric, deliver a message that people in these countries believe, and they vote them. They vote the leadership in the late 1980s out, and was replaced with the new leadership, like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela in the 1990s, like Evo Morales in Bolivia. So they basically saw, no, they are selling us an idea that is not going to work. It's not working, and it's not going to work. We need new leaders, and that's how they install the new left presidents in Latin America. Yep.
Thank you.
And again,
how long do you think they'll last for?
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Tell me again. I didn't hear what you said.
Oh, how long do you think it'll last for?
Last for the new left?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, keep in mind that we are just halfway through the semester. The story continues. So I am going to next week, not next week, this Wednesday, I am going to start this PowerPoint presentation that I've been using for several years, and I update the presentation every year. So at the very end of the presentation, you are going to see that what used to be, many people start calling this not a red wave, like in the Soviet times, in the 60s, during the Cold War. They start calling this the, let me apologize to the ladies, but this because, you know, I'm gonna use something that is really terrible. But they used to start calling this the pink wave. It was not totally red, but it was reddish, like pink. You know, the Soviet ideas are coming with this new left, right? Anyway, the point is that Latin America was becoming pink, but some things start happening in Brazil that, you know, Lula da Silva is gone, right? Although I have to qualify that because he's trying to come back. You know, he's after Bolsonaro right now. We'll talk about that. But the point is that we are in the middle of the story. Right now, we are just about to enter the new left. We're going to discuss a lot of the new left. And then we are going to start looking into more contemporaneous Latin America, which is what is going to be all these linkages to migration, to narco traffic, and things that I think are going to be way more interesting to you guys. But once again, I couldn't do it before discussing all this history, right? Anyway, I am over time. I don't want to take more of your time, guys. I'm going to stop now. I'm going to stop recording now.